Well, thank you for that nice introduction. This is going to switch over, I hope, magically to my presentation. But in the meantime, I want to tell you that my husband, Rick Valicenti, who's a fabulous designer, helped me crop my slides, which I'm hoping will imminently show up. There they are. And usually there's a disclaimer about all errors will be mine, but I've decided that I'll say that if there are any errors, they're his, okay? So, and he's here. But anyways, the reason I was asked to speak on this is I wrote a book on this subject. And it's, this picture here is by a wonderful Dutch, I guess this is actually in charcoal and different media, but anyways, artist. And it's called The Three Brides. His name's John Torup. And it shows a virginal bride, a sort of interim bride, and then on the right, the devil's bride. And this picture so completely, even though it's not medieval, captured the thesis of my book that I decided I just had to use it. So there it goes. I was told by colleagues that I could not call a book The Bride of Christ Goes to Hell. But I'm here to tell you that I did. I don't think it's necessarily helped me in the profession. But I believe truth in packaging, this really is about the Bride of Christ going to hell. So I will begin. The first brides of Christ were members of the Roman Empire. These were the first people who consecrated their virginity to God. And they were women, and we don't really know very much about them. Why don't we know much about them? Well, interestingly, even though many of them were good friends with various church fathers and scrupulously kept all of the letters of these church fathers, no one ever kept their letters, the women's letters. So, but they liked to portray women in thoughtful poses, holding pens, which I've always thought was sort of ironic. So here is an anonymous woman from Pompeii holding a pen. And so the reason I'm showing this is it's women in Rome who were amongst the earliest converts to Christianity, not men. And one wonders, what is it that Christianity had to offer them that made it so appealing? Well, I think that one of the answers to this is that there might have been a general antipathy to marriage. Okay? Marriage was the inevitable lot of every free-born woman in the classical world. And in fact, the life expectancy of women was incredibly low. Women could marry as early as 12, but we do have accounts of them marrying at 9. There's a horrible account of a pregnant 9-year-old, if you can imagine. And the life expectancy of women in the empire, and this is if you average them all out, was 25. So that's putting in the old people too. So women could very easily die in childbirth. And of course, there's also submission to a husband. And the cult of virginity, I mean, Christianity is the first thing that ever made non-marriage a possibility to women in the classical world. And so the cult of virginity was very popular with women and may account for the conversion to Christianity, or the appeal. Christianity idealized chastity for all sorts of reasons. It probably started with St. Paul, and his reasons were very pragmatic. He thought the time was short, that Christ was going to come back as he had promised. But then Christ didn't come right away. And chastity, rather than for pragmatic reasons, we should be chaste and save ourselves for God and not have children, chastity started to develop other motives, to become a kind of good in itself. And the female intact body was considered to be something that was incredibly venerable. And there were some elusive instances in Scripture that would validate this. For example, in the Revelation, the last book of the New Testament, the Revelation of St. John, it said that that there would be 144,000 virgins who followed the Lamb, and the Lamb was Christ. And so this gave them the idea that virginity not only won rewards on earth, but there's also special merit in heaven to being a consecrated virgin. Okay? Now, there's a real problem about that, is if you put women on a very high pedestal, or anyone on a very high pedestal, there is much, much further to fall. Okay. So, where did the concept of the bride of Christ come from? In fact, it's a very ancient metaphor. It was first used to describe Yahweh's relationship with Israel, and then the Christians adopted it and started appropriating the language of the Song of Songs, which is this beautiful love poem from Hebrew scripture that was attributed to King Solomon. And it's about the search of this bride for her bridegroom. It's very sensual, and so, of course, the Christians weren't going to take it as a definitely sensual thing. They allegorized it, and the bride was frequently interpreted as the soul. The soul in Latin is actually feminine, so there was a reason why the soul was understood as the bride. And the bridegroom was Christ. Another way of understanding it was the bride representing the church, and of course, again, the bridegroom as Christ. And there's a beautiful illumination of the bride seeking the bridegroom, and she's crowned because one of the lines in the Song of Songs is, "Come to Lebanon and you will be crowned, my love." And anyways, there she is, pursuing her bridegroom. Now, this, of course, began as an allegory, but as we're going to see, it's going to become embodied very soon. And women are going to be referred to as brides of Christ. Well, why? I mean, this was a very real question to me. I wondered when I first began this project why women whose vocation was really spurning marriage and really didn't want to have anything to do with the institution. And there was a whole literature that built up that's called molestium nuptiarum, which just means the bothers of marriage. And it would talk about the pains of pregnancy, how it stopped all the possibility of philosophical thinking, et cetera, et cetera. But also, virginity, they had this idea that a woman could somehow transcend her gender and become a virile woman or a kind of honorary man if she embraced virginity. And of course, this is a rise in status. So why would these women want to be called brides? Well, I think the answer is that they really didn't. Okay? This was imposed upon them. The first time ever it was used to be applied to flesh and blood people was in the 2nd century by really the first Western theologian of any sophistication, Tertullian. And he was from Carthage, and in Carthage there was a bunch of consecrated virgins who were getting very uppity. They had special status in the church, and they thought that they were living the life of the angels because the virginity became associated with the vita angelica, the angelic life that's supposed to be post-sexual. And so they thought they didn't need to wear veils, all right? Because veils signified two important things in the ancient world. First, it was a gender differentiation, right? Men kept their head uncovered for the glory of God. Women should be wearing veils. The second reason was it was also a symbol of subordination. So we've got gender and subordination, and these women who had escaped the constraints imposed by marriage, escaped submission to a husband, and thought that they'd escaped the problems associated with the female sex, didn't want to wear veils. Well, Tertullian was there to tell them that they weren't unmarried at all. They were married to Christ, and they should put veils on their head and start behaving like decent matrons, right? So this is the first instance where we actually have brides of Christ. And it's a very interesting historic moment because as soon as you attach the metaphor to the woman, and a metaphor that is associated with, in a lot of ways, an oppressive institution, the ball gets rolling, and it's really unstoppable. Already in the 3rd century, the Bishop of Carthage, same stomping ground as Tertullian, started talking about brides of Christ committing Adultery. What was adultery? Well, wearing makeup, doing various different things, acting too freely, etc. And he started using disciplinary language from marriage, like, what would Christ the bridegroom say to this? Wouldn't it be sort of like whoring? Might he not come in with a sword and cut off his bride's head? And it becomes kind of interesting. On the one hand, he talks about the virgin state as really a wonderful thing and very elevated. And yet, on the other hand, because it is so wonderful and elevated, it needs to be very carefully supervised. And he thought that all these women should stay indoors all the time. So far from having a certain kind of freedom with virginity, it very soon becomes associated with the cloister, which is what we think of in religious communities, right? Okay. Now, with the conversion of the Roman Empire, Christianity was illegal from the beginning of the faith up until basically 313, and then there was an edict tolerating Christianity. It wasn't yet the religion of the empire, but it was on its way to becoming that. St. Ambrose was one of the big figures in the promotion of the cult of virginity in the 4th century. The reason that virginity became even more important and at higher premium is that because Christianity was no longer illegal, it was very hard to get martyred, and which is an instant way to heaven. And so virginity and different kinds of asceticism were seen as, self-martyrdom, self-mortification. Now, Ambrose is very important. Well, he was the Bishop of Milan, which was one of the most important bishoprics in the West, but he's also was very important from the perspective of the history of virginity, because he wrote 4 treatises on it and sort of had the loudest voice. The 4th century was really the age of virginity. There were something like 77 treatises on virginity, all dedicated to women, all saying, consecrate your virginity to Christ. Ambrose is going to take it one step further by appropriating the ceremony that was used in Roman weddings and marrying these women to Christ in the church on Easter Day. And this is the bridal flammeum that the Roman bride would wear when she was being transported to her husband's house. I mean, the marriage would happen in stages. The transportation to the husband's house and was just prior to consummation, and she'd wear this glorious red veil. Well, he started using the veils and veiling them in church, etc. And it was quite a spectacle. And his treatises and the ceremony itself was all steeped in the sensual language of the Song of Songs about, waiting for the bridegroom and the mysteries of the wedding chamber, etc., etc. Okay, so how do the Romans feel about this? Because, in fact, one of the huge crises of the period was declining population, right? Especially in the patrician, the ruling class. And a lot of them did not want their daughters as consecrated virgins and got very angry with Ambrose. But Ambrose, rallied and had some sort of bogus crack at explaining demography and explaining that virginity really wasn't going to hurt, etc. Meanwhile, he bussed women in from they didn't have buses, but you know what I mean. He bussed women in from the provinces and kept going with these incredible veilings of many virgins on Easter Sundays. Okay. Right around this time, we have what historians think of as the chastity wars, because, the Romans had really had enough of this. They were pragmatic, straight-ahead people. They really valued the family. All these women who weren't going to reproduce and, hung out by themselves, it wasn't their idea of what they were bringing up their highborn daughters to. And so they pushed back. And there were a couple of people, and in fact, these guys were both monks, and yet they argued that marriage was on a par of virginity, as virginity was the same, and the example they used was the Virgin Mary, who after Christ was born, everybody believed that she conceived by the Holy Spirit, and so conceived without any human help. However, it was also understood that Joseph and Mary went on to have children after Christ was born. which would make sense. I mean, they were, normal Jewish traditions. I mean, it would be very weird if they didn't continue to have children, especially since it says in Scripture that Mary went to hear Christ preach and was standing outside the gates with his brethren. So that would imply brothers, sisters or whatever. Well, in fact, what's going to become the Orthodox group is going to push back very strongly and say, are you kidding? There's no way that marriage is on a par with virginity, because the Virgin Mary was not just a virgin before giving birth. Her hymen remained intact miraculously after giving birth, and she never went on to have children. And besides that, she'd vowed her virginity to God, and so had Joseph. And around this time, she is in fact given the official title by a church council of I Parthenos, which means ever virgin, meaning she never lost her virginity. And so the marriage of Mary and Joseph is going to be put at the center of Christian marriage, the theories of Christian marriage, and it's unconsummated. Here's the marriage of the Virgin. It looks like a normal marriage, but, it was a very pure marriage. It was a pure marriage that nevertheless fulfilled all of the Christian things that Augustine had articulated were essential in marriage, which was offspring, sacrament, and indissolubility. And so those three things were all there: the mystery of the sacrament of the union, the indissolubility, and the offspring of Christ. Of course, it was a hard model to reproduce, so it was kind of a dangerous model, but anyways, that's what they had. And Christ's brethren were considered to be cousins from Joseph's side. Now, though virginity, I've been stressing the physical aspects of virginity. The church fathers weren't, crude materialists. They did emphasize that someone could be technically a virgin, but, I don't know, corrupted through lascivious thoughts or who knows what. But virginity should be primarily a state of mind, And this was a very interesting pushback against the emphasis on physicality. Nevertheless, the Romans themselves had a great respect, not necessarily for the cult of virginity. There were only 7 Vestal virgins in the Roman religion, right? But one of their founding stories was about the matron Lucretia, who had been raped by the ruling family of the Etruscan kings. And this led to the expulsion of the kings and the foundation of Rome as a republic. And so this was a story that was very dear to their hearts. Lucretia had been threatened that if she didn't succumb to this guy's overtures, he would kill her and kill a couple of slaves and say that they caught her in the act, whoring. So she endured being defiled just so that her name wouldn't be tarnished, because fama was everything to Roman culture. But when her family came back, she had been left alone, she called everybody together, told them what happened. They tried to comfort her, saying that chastity was a state of mind, but she would have nothing of it. She said she didn't want her name to be used for women to have light morals in Rome, and she stabbed herself in front of everybody. So this is one of the founding stories of Rome, and the church fathers started engaging the question of, did she do the right thing? Should you stab yourself to preserve your chastity? Well, now there's 2 views on this. Augustine, who actually was is going to end up being one of the most powerful of the church fathers, said that virginity is a state of mind. This was an unfortunate situation, but he also does use this interesting phrase about 2 people were involved in the act, but only one person arose pure from the bed. So his perspective was, mentally, she retained her chastity, But 2 of his other colleagues, Ambrose, who we've met, and Jerome, thought that consecrated virgins were fully justified if they were attacked in taking their own lives to preserve their virginity, which is a very extreme stance, because Christianity, in theory, doesn't condone suicide. Now, you could say that's not suicide, they're killing themselves to preserve their virginity, etc., but it does push the fetishization of virginity even further. Okay, so now with the fall of Rome, all of these questions of consecrated virgins being potentially under attack become more real because there are barbarians moving around, monasteries are being attacked, etc., etc. But interestingly, the Germanic women, the Germanic successor states that had invented the Roman Empire, are going to find monasticism and consecrated virginity every bit as attractive as the women of the early church did, maybe for some of the same reasons. And if they were royal wives, if they'd been married, they would often have a dowry and would use it to found a monastery and gather holy women around themselves and live in a female self-governed place, which might have been appealing after years of marriage to a barbarian king. Hard to say. I mean, it probably changes from king to king. But anyways, this focus, they still have this focus on virginity, and it's pretty rough on these royal widows, right? They want to retire with a degree of dignity, and yet they're not virgins. So they can never be veiled by the bishop, right? They have to veil themselves, and they usually can't be abbess because they're not pure, okay? And what we're looking at now is a picture that depicts in different scenes aspects of the life of Saint Radegund, who was a Thuringian princess who'd been captured by Clothar in the 6th century. She was a booty bride. It was marriage by capture. He already had several wives, even though he was nominally Christian. And so she had to put up with this guy for a while. This picture shows us how she's dining with her husband, but when he's in bed, she spends all her time on her knees, and then when it's time to go to bed, she sleeps on the floor. So she's as close to living a chaste life as she possibly can under the circumstances. And then Clothar murders her brother, and she decides that she's going to unilaterally end this marriage. And she flees and tries to get someone to veil her as a virgin. Well, they can't veil her as a virgin. She's not. And so they make her impose the veil herself, so she doesn't get the honorific one. And she's given the title deaconess. And then she goes off and founds a monastery because she had the dough. And here she is entering the monastery, okay? Sadly, however, she never got to be abbess of her monastery because she wasn't a virgin, and that remained to her niece, Adelind. Okay. Now, there were other ways to go about this, okay? I mean, to retire from queenship, found a monastery, and still get to be abbess. And Ethelthryth, 7th century Anglo-Saxon princess, managed to do this and remain a virgin. She was married twice, withstood consummation through both marriages, and you can see this because she's holding a lily, which is the sign of virginity, and then went off and founded a monastery at Ely where she got to be abbess, right? But it's probably kind of hard to hold out against consummation through 2 marriages. And some people think that perhaps she didn't manage to have children and she was really repudiated. So this was like a face-saving legend, right? Let's at least make the poor princess into a saint, sort of, okay? Possible. Now, there were other virgins who adhered, sadly, to the more rigorous advice given by Ambrose and Jerome about what to do if your virginity is under attack. This is unfortunately a bad slide of Saint Ebba of Coldingham, who in the 9th century learned that the Danes were roving around, and the Danes were very fearful to the British. I mean, there's a long coastline. Monasteries were sitting ducks for marauders because they usually had a lot of wealth in them, and a community of women would be especially at risk. So she knew these Danes were coming. She's there with her community of women. She's the abbess. What does she tell them to do? Well, she was very pragmatic. She didn't say kill yourself. She said cut off your nose and your lips, and then we will be sufficiently repulsive that we won't be defiled. And so they followed suit. And when the Danes came, they were repelled and they burnt down the monastery. So okay, sad story. But the good news is these women got to maintain their virginity and also were considered to be martyrs. So that's great. Martyrs of virginity. I mean, it's better than nothing. And by the way, I know they're working for diminishing rewards, okay? I mean, Danes are coming. You got to do something. I mean, they were being proactive and for what they believed in. Okay, but this is where the expression "cutting off your nose to spite your face" comes from, is from this horrible practice, right? And other saints, like in the 13th century, someone that we're more sure exists because there was a big process of canonization, Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, she, when her husband dies and her family wants to remarry her, she threatens exactly that. I'm going to cut off my nose and then no one will have me. And that's how they punished adulteresses very often, was by slitting their nose. So, it really was a way of uglifying somebody pretty fast. Okay. Now, in the 12th century, things are going to change a little bit. A lot, okay? Actually, it might be one of the biggest changes in Western history. I mean, those people of you probably like the Renaissance. Believe me, 12 things happened in the 12th century that were unbelievable. And one of the things was a real revolution in ethics and the assessment of where sin lay and what is deserving of merit. And this was spearheaded by the great Peter Abelard. In his book, Ethica, he talks about God using a phrase from Psalms as the seer of heart and reins. And it's only God who can see within a person and assess the sin of a person, okay? And that could mean that a person is a virgin in their heart, but at a technical virgin isn't a virgin at all. So they're going back, and he's taking very seriously the claims of the various church fathers that virginity was mostly a mental state, and he really ran with it. And he didn't just do that. He also revolutionized the whole penitential system by making sin an interior kind of thing rather than eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of thing. Okay? So now Abelard had a real personal stake in this because he wanted to win a respectable place for his wife Eloise in the category of celestial merit. As you may or may not know, Abelard and Eloise had a very tragic love affair. He ended up being castrated, and by the uncle of Eloise, and they had been married at the time, but it was a clandestine marriage, but they were still bound to each other. And so he wanted to enter a monastery, and she had to do it as well. And she was very unhappy there and wrote a series of letters to him, pathetic letters, talking about her sexual frustration and about how she won no merit from God. She knew all this Abelardian ethics. And she says, because the seer of heart and rein can see that I'm doing nothing for his sake, I do everything for your sake. Well, anyways, he saw his new role in his life as a spiritual director, not any longer as husband, and he wanted to reconcile her to her role, and he wanted very much to win this title, Sponsa Christi, for Bride of Christ, for his non-virginal wife. And I think that's one of the driving forces in his exploration of intention, etc., is his relationship with Eloise. But there they are. They're both. He's more dressed like he's supposed to be a monk, but we can't see his tonsure. He's wearing a cap, but you can certainly see that she's dressed as a nun. Okay. The other great impetus that I'd like to focus on in the 12th century that's quite extraordinary is introduced by Bernard of Clairvaux, who ironically, he's a saint. Abelard isn't, but Bernard is, and he was Abelard's great foe. Abelard was a very cutting-edge thinker, and Bernard was a conservative thinker in some ways and organized a conference that basically destroyed Abelard. He went to appeal to the Pope. He was declared a heretic, but he collapsed on the way and ended his life, sadly, in a religious community. But anyways, Bernard was in his own way quite revolutionary in really the realm of what we call affective piety, a kind of piety that's based on emotionality and reaching out to God and developing more of a personal relationship. And this is going to lead to the rise of mysticism. Now, it wasn't just with God. Bernard was a special devotee of the Virgin Mary, and this was the time when in the 12th century, all of the churches started being dedicated to Mary. I mean, Mary, the cult of Mary was huge, and of course, she is the ever-Virgin after all. And here, in case you're wondering what's happening, I think this will give you an example of the physicality of affective piety. His special devotion to the Virgin Mary allowed him to receive milk from her breast. So you see milk, this is the lactation of St. Bernard. She's good aim, squirting it right into his mouth. Okay? Yeah, my students love this one, I gotta tell you. Oh. So his brand of piety also emphasized union with God. He's got this one treatise on the love of God that talks about 7 different stages in rising to God. The 7th stage being death, when you have full union, but in the 6th stage you get pretty far through meditation. And the other thing that he did that was probably the most influential from the perspective I'm thinking about is that he wrote a series of sermons on the Song of Songs, which were addressed to his monks at Clairvaux. In these sermons, he was kind of a gender bender. The monks took the role as bride, and they were asked to imagine kissing the groom, Christ, etc., etc. And it was a kind of democratization. That potentiality had always been there, because remember that the soul was the sort of original bride of Christ. But Bernard is, in a way, reappropriating the title of bride from consecrated virgins and extending it to everybody, democratizing it, as it were. Okay? And this is going to have a huge impact, because in the 13th century, we're going to see the rise of what's often referred to as bridal mysticism. Suddenly, there are going to be women who are communing with God and go into trances, and they see themselves as brides of Christ, and they will have nuptial, marriage-focused revelations, etc. And they particularly like phrases like, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of my mouth," which is of his mouth, which is what he's doing there. Christ embracing the bride. Okay, so these women are again way outside of the usual realm of the consecrated virgin. Most of them are uncloistered. These mystics. Okay, and when they call it bridal mysticism, because their vehicle for reaching God and understanding union with him was all very nuptial in nature. So eventually some of these women had actual marriages with Christ, okay? And they were becoming progressively embodied. They described them, all these different stages, about the dowry they received, about the advice they received from their future mother-in-law, Mary, who's also, by the way, described as a bride of Christ. Go figure. I mean, it's complicated. He's also, married to his mother in a way. But here we have a picture of Catherine of Siena, one of the few female doctors of the church, marrying Christ. And this is described as the apex of her spiritual life by her confessor, Raymond of Capua. But he says that the ring that Christ gave her, because they actually did marry with rings in those days too, was a nice diamond with 4 pearls, very tastefully set. She tells us in her letters that Christ married her with his foreskin. So I think that shows. I see some wrinkled up faces. However, From a practical standpoint, this was the only piece of Christ that was left on earth, right? I mean, he did rise into heaven. And so naturally, the medievals were going to make a cult out of it, right? I mean, there were actually 2 churches that claimed the holy foreskin. So, but she had a revelation of being married with it. You can see where things are going. They're getting much more physical as history goes along. Now, this is also the period where there's going to be profound devotion to the passion of Christ, and the depictions of Christ are going to get bloodier and bloodier. Here is a very bloody Christ. It's from a devotional book that was made for nuns. It's not a high-end picture, and it shows Bridget of Sweden at the foot of the cross, meditating on Christ. Okay, Bridget of Sweden, very important 14th century saint. She had been married and she was widowed, and she had 8 children, and yet she was a bride of Christ. So this is like we're moving further and further into the pattern of democratization. I should also tell you that these women who were married and had revelations brought their experiences from marriage into the relationship. In the Song of Songs, the nuptial bed with the groom is deferred. I mean, they don't get to consummate the marriage until they're in heaven. But Bridget had a series of revelations where she experienced a mystical pregnancy. And her confessor apparently could bear testimony to this. He put his hand, he could feel, oh yeah, it does feel like a mystical pregnancy. And this is actually quite well documented, because at this period they started doing elaborate processes of canonization. So they would have witnesses and a lot of evidence, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, I don't have a slide of her mystical pregnancy with her confessor. I don't think such a one exists. But anyways, Bridget women in the Middle Ages obviously are going to have a subordinate role compared to men. And mysticism is going to be a launching pad for incredible amounts of power for some of these women. And Bridget is a case in point. She managed to dictate and pronounce to popes. She denounced sinful kings. The king Magnus in Sweden, she accused of sodomy in one of her revelations. It had been revealed to her by God that he'd had this, sodomitical relationship. And she wasn't afraid of anyone because it was God speaking through her, and she could always say, oh, well, it's not me, it's him. But so here we see her, she founded a religious order, and it was dictated, the rule of the order was dictated to her by an angel who you see whispering in her ear, who was directly translating the ordinances of Christ and Mary. Okay? So what's interesting here is mysticism is allowing women who are illiterate to have incredible authority over all sorts of powerful people. Bridget had some of the most important clerics at her time writing down her revelations, translating them from Swedish, God-spoken Swedish, into Latin so other people could read them, etc. Now, late in life, God gave Bridget the gift of reading Latin, which I wish he'd do with some of my students, but maybe they have to be more saintly than that. Okay. Now, as you can probably guess from what I've been telling you, the physicality of mysticism is going to become a problem, okay? Most women went into trances when they received their visions, and these were periods of insensibility in which they couldn't feel anything, and they became quite a spectacle. There's one instance of a holy woman in the south of France, Dusseline, who they thought that her trances might be bogus, and they actually poured molten lead over her feet, and she didn't flinch, and they would poke them, etc., etc. So these women received these ecstasies or raptures, and I think that the words ecstasies or raptures will tell you something about one of the dangers of them, right? We often associate those words with sexual feelings, And there's a fine line between the sensual and the sexual. And the medievals were no different. In fact, rapture, or the Latin word raptus, was the same word for rape as it was for this divine connection with God. And the sexual aspect, or the sensual aspect that might seem sexual, of this ecstasy is especially apparent. This is post-medieval, however, I think it still proves the point, in Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa. Okay, there's an angel that is putting arrows in her heart. This is something that she sees in one of her raptures. And here's a close-up of her face. Now, Jacques Lacan, the psychoanalyst's reading of this is, of course, that this is a sublimated orgasm. Okay? Oh, I better rush. I just got the sign. How many minutes have I got?
15 minutes.
Okay, so we only have 15 minutes left?
Correct.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go through this very quickly because we haven't gotten to hell yet. Okay. Okay, from the 12th century on, they began depicting the devil as a monster, okay? But we should remember that this is from Ravenna from the 5th century, this mosaic, that Satan began as a beautiful angel and could recreate that form anytime he wanted. This is the first picture ever of Satan from Ravenna, and he's a beautiful blue angel there. And the medievals knew that he could appear as an angel of light. And so, and already in the 13th century, we start to have instances of nuns mistaking satanic Christs for Christ himself. You know, Christ dressing up as Satan, Satan dressing up as Christ, etc., etc. We also start to see the rise of stories like the magician Merlin, who was supposed to have been conceived by an incubus, which is a little devil, and a princess. In the 13th century, this story is recast. So it's a nun who's being violated. Anyways, in the 15th century, we're going to see the rise of treatises on sorcery and also a new genre called the discernment of spirits that's going to target women and accuse them of confusing divine and diabolical revelations, okay? And this kind of spiritual delusion, which a lot of people were concerned about, will get more intense. This is John Nieder, bad picture, sorry, ardent admirer of Gerson, who reported extensively about deluded mystics, and the last one he deals with was Joan of Arc, who was a contemporary. And then it leads right from Joan of Arc into the new diabolical heresy of witchcraft, in which people, primarily women, renounce their baptism and worship Satan. And then in this contemporary, slightly older contemporary of Nieder, writes this poem, The Champion of Women. There's a dialogue between an adversary and a champion. And this is the first time that we actually hear about, oh, dear God, Jesus Christ, what an error, he says. The woman is married to the devil. And he's talking about witches who are giving themselves over sexually as his bride. And by the time we get to this very important manual for witch hunting, Malleus Maleficarum, the solidification of females and witches has already become secure. The A there indicates that we're talking about witches, female witches, okay? If it was an O, it would have been male or both. And then finally, I think the decline of female spirituality is thrown into especially sharp relief by these witch trials at Arras, where a female is inducted into the witches' cult through an inverted ritual that's almost identical to the induction of a virgin as bride of Christ. Now, how did this happen? Very quickly, okay? I would say that there's partially the tendency for medievals and us to think in binaries, hot, cold, wet, dry, virgin, whore, that kind of thing. But in addition, there's a kind of literalism to Christian thinking in the Middle Ages, like go to the devil, right? Here's a father saying go to the devil, and the devil comes and picks up the kid he told to go to the devil. And so it's very easy for the medievals to move between the metaphorical into the concrete. Okay? And the bride of Christ became a metaphor, but remember that Christianity is an incarnational religion where the word is made flesh, and that there's a kind of inevitability to this abstract becoming concrete. And in women's case, this was unfortunately disastrous because women's body was considered to be colder, more carnal, more desirous of sex, and their spirituality was embodied and based on the imagination, which was the only part of the mind that was accessible to demons. I mean, there's all sorts of physiological reasons for mistrusting women. And so the sheer weight of the bride's body would eventually drag her to hell. Thank you. Okay.
We do have a couple of minutes for questions if there's anyone in the audience here that'd like to ask.
Yes? Oh, I think you're supposed to come with a...
I'll come over to you with the microphone. Okay. I won't hog it.
Hear me? Were the early virgins successors to the Vestal virgins?
No, they weren't really, actually. The Vestal virgins also, once they turned 30, could go off and marry. I think few of them did. But there's no real continuity there, you know? It's an interesting question, though.
Are current nuns now all brides of Christ?
Yes.
And what does it mean more?
The current nuns, as far as I know, have an elaborate wedding ritual. I think that in some orders they even put on wedding dresses to receive the veil. And then they go into another, they put on wedding dresses, they receive a ring, they go into another room, and then they come back holding their veil, and then they're veiled by the bishop. But first they dress up as virginal brides in white dresses, yeah. So it's a very powerful image. Yes?
You said that there artifacts of Jesus' foreskin. Well, how could that exist? He was born a Jew. They have to be circumcised.
It's a miracle, right? One of the essential things about miracle is incorruptible flesh. So how much, virginal flesh isn't supposed to corrupt? So one would assume that would especially be extended to Jesus. It still exists in a church in Chelles in France. If anyone wants to go see it, I never have. Yes? Are we done?
Oh, no. We'll take a couple more.
In a broader context, there was a period of time when the clergy could marry and presumably have children.
Yes, yes.
How does your conversation,
Right.
your tie into that?
Well, it's very interesting because, prior to the 11th century, most of the lower clergy, and I mean people below bishops, probably were married, especially north of the Alps. But the popes had, in fact, been trying to get them to be celibate, chaste, since the 4th century. They were only able to impose it in the 11th century. And a lot of people see that as a kind of monasticization of the secular clergy, of the clergy that worked in the world. Now, obviously, chastity is going to be valued for both sexes, but it's more powerful for women because of the hymen was considered like circumcision, the seal with Christ. But nevertheless, purity, especially with the rise of the importance of the sacraments, they started believing that they started believing in something called transubstantiation, that the actual elements become the real body and blood of Christ. And the 11th century reformers who were going to impose celibacy on the clergy made very powerful arguments that someone who gets to handle Christ should not be touching whores, as they called them, their wives. So it's partially also to do with the rise of the clergy, and separating the laity from the clergy. For what better way than in setting them apart so they couldn't marry? Thanks, but it's a complex question. I hope I answered it.
Are there any other questions out there? Nope. We'll take one more question. We have a little bit of time.
I just wondered if there's any connection that you make between this and the tradition of courtly love.
Courtly love, huh? Well, you know something? I know that there are some theories that courtly love is supposed to be unconsummated. But most of the instances, woman on a pedestal. Oh man, if only I could have her. Most of them are seeking consummation. So I think but I think that there is a lot of crossover between the erotics of the Song of Songs and the kind of way they talk about the woman, the lady. My colleague Barbara Newman has actually written a lot about the crossover between secular poetry and religious poetry in this period. So there is a lot of correspondence. Because in fact, love only has one language, right? We don't have a lot of words for it and stuff. So confusing the carnal with the spiritual is a very easy thing. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, that concludes our session today.